Thank you for joining another episode of Beyond the Veil. I am thrilled to be here with Joanna LaPrade, PhD and Jungian psychologist and author of the book Forged in Darkness. So Joanna, thank you so much for joining. And I've been anticipating this discussion for a long time. I can't wait to get into this discussion of Carl Jung and also your work.
Amazing. Well, thank you for having me.
So let's dive into Carl Jung as a person. So there may be some of those listening, watching who may not be completely familiar with Carl Jung. Let's do a little bit of a quick intro into this man and his influence in many fields of study. And what is he most known for?
So Jung is considered to be one of the founders of analytical psychology, following Freud, who would probably be its most championed founder. What Jung is most, I think, credited for in the modern world is really taking the unconscious psyche seriously as a background for human experience. A lot of psychologies, especially nowadays, are much more concerned about kind of the orientation of your conscious mind, or what I would call an ego psychology, where Jungian psychology is much more interested in kind of that which is underneath the table, and that governs our life, but isn't necessarily something that we are privy to. Jung, in the many kind of contributions to analytical psychology, Jung psychology is most known and most distinct for kind of how he envisioned the unconscious to be structured. And this is kind of his, like, one of his major breaks from Freud, and really allowed him his opus, is that he argues, yes, we have this kind of personal unconscious that is the warehouse of our own repressed material and kind of the personal nature in us. And we also, that rests on top of a collective psyche, which is impersonal and transpersonal and timeless. And that, is kind of the warehouse of the archetypal energies and repeats itself in all human psyches. And so Jung spent a lot of time concerned with how our individual life is influenced by that collective unconscious, and the kind of apex energy in that would be what Jung calls the self. And so, which is the larger personality within. And, to your question of what is Jung most known for, I think the Jungian project is really about taking the modern mind and teaching it how to relate to this really ancient wisdom within us that speaks to us through symbol and myth and in our dreams, and has a larger purpose for us in our life, that the project as an individual life is to discern that purpose, which Jung calls individuation, the kind of becoming of oneself. And so in the kind of canon of analytical psychology, I think it's probably pretty fair and maybe a little controversial to say, like, Jung really moves into the spiritual and the mystic and the imaginal realms in a way that a lot of other analytical psychologists don't. And in that way, really trying to answer or respond to what he perceived to be the kind of soullessness and disconnection from source that is a hallmark quality of the modern psyche.
And you mentioned the archetype aspect, the symbology and myth, and this is something you specialized in as well. So maybe describe what this means and how he worked in this particular area of study, but also how we can become closer with these archetypes within ourselves, or how can we identify certain archetypes within our own being, and how we can work with that for understanding our deeper selves or certain aspects that may be beneath the surface.
Yeah, I mean, big question, but I'll give it a go. To begin, archetype, the word archetype comes from the Greek arche, which means first. And the idea is that there are these constructs or principles within, almost like blueprints, that structure and provide a predisposition for knowing, that repeat themselves in all human beings. So the image that I like to use for an archetype is a vase. It's like we all have a form, you know, of these ideas within us, like mother, father, war, love, you know, that outside of culture, outside of time, outside of, you know, geography, we see these same ideas repeat themselves in the human experience. And those ideas are kind of like vessels, right, of vases, but each vase gets put in a specific person, in a specific culture, at a specific time, and a different liquid gets poured into that vase. But the essence of what that liquid is being poured into does not change. So in other words, like another image that is like commonly described as like an envelope, like you'd get an envelope in the mail that said love, but like what's in the envelope is going to be personal to you, right? So your vision of mother and my vision of mother are different because we have different mothers and we have different experiences, but there is kind of a knowing within, right, that the mother is responsible for nurturance and holding and caring and birth and also providing, but potentially devouring. That like there are these qualities that kind of repeat themselves, and those qualities are archetypal. And so for Jung, he felt that we have almost this individual experience that kind of sprouts itself from this collective stratum, and to know ourselves more deeply and embed ourselves into the tradition of knowing and explanation for living, we have to kind of get into this archetypal layer. And so, you know, how is that unfolded? And I mean, it's a really good question and a complex one. I would say kind of in the beginning, it's really about a perspective or an attitude, to be looking for what is larger behind things. You know, if you're struggling, for example, and you feel like you're really trying to let something go in your life, you could say, yeah, I'm struggling and I have to let go of something and I have to, you know, hopefully something else comes of that. It's like, okay, yeah, archetypally, that's a pattern of death and rebirth, right? It puts that individual experience into this collective deeper stratum that for people, I think, especially in the modern era where we're really disconnected from our traditions, you know, the individual project of meaning in the modern era is a lot for people to hold. And the archetypal perspective reminds that actually these stories that you think you're doing in your individuality are not that individual. You know, you're concerned with rescuing people in your life. You want your family to, you know, do a better job. It's like, that's the savior archetype. People have done that for a long time. You know, like, are you a healer that comes from a place of their own wounds? That's a wounded healer. We have mythologies, we have stories, we have so much collective material that gives meaning to that individual experience and roots us into something timeless that can hold that individual experience. You know, like, are you undergoing a process of change and it's really hard and you don't really want to do it? And you know, nonetheless, there are trials that keep getting presented to you and you rise to those trials. It's like, that's the hero's journey. You know, we've been telling the hero myth for eons. And so, you know, what becomes so important in that really is that there is a recognition in the individual being that this story has played itself out before. We are all a part of something larger. And I think in this really disconnected individual age, there's a deep panacea for that in people.
Yeah, I agree, definitely. What do you think what do you think would be the main cause of the detachment from these deeper meanings within ourselves?
I mean, it's very, you know, it's very multifaceted. I would say kind of in the beginning, you know, if you take the kind of march of modernity seriously, you know, it's like we moved away from traditional religious structures of knowing and ritual that were embedded in land, that were embedded in ancestry, that were really intimate. We moved into cities. We moved away from that kind of like animistic, symbolic worldview. We moved into cities. We sped up our pace. We chose rationality, right? The Enlightenment era preferred a contained and spirited mind that was, you know, working on its ascension. we focused on rationality. We split the world through, Cartesian dualism and that sense of a scientific knowing that was, about the mechanism and the temporal reality. And we moved away from what was fantasy and what was imaginal and what was myth, and created this kind of new society that was very new for the psyche, right? The psyche is like the body. It is an old thing. It did not evolve in those 100 years or in the years since, right? We as a species think much more symbolically than we do rationally, actually, in our beings. And so we moved into this era that had, more secularism to it, more science to it, more rationality, more individualism, a faster pace. All of this disconnected us from this kind of ancient, true knowing of what it meant to be human and what rooted us in that. And then we invented psychology and called ourselves sick. And it's like not a mistake. Right, that those things marched together. And now in our world, I think that's become even more extreme, that we really struggle to be with a deeper or an analytical approach to ourselves, because we prioritize perfection. We're a very hygienic mind. We culturally want to be like kind of on the march of progress, on the march of getting better. I talk about this all the time with the people that I work to with, is just this fantasy that our growth is a ladder is very modern. It's like, oh, I just have to climb up this ladder and I'll just keep going and get better and better and better, and it'll be a straight line. And it's like, no, growth, as all mythologies tell us, is a serpent. And it's like it moves and it spirals and it has its own way. And we're really, really disconnected from that.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, I love that. And you mentioned earlier in our earlier previous discussion that not many areas of study focus on Jung's work. It's very, you have to search for his work in order to.
You do have to search for Jung's work.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, Jung is, as a, if we take his life, he's Swiss, which, he is addressing the problems of the modern Western mind, and he is embedded in that mind, right? And I think Jung there's a tension in all of Jung's writing, and it evolves as his work gets, as he ages and his work evolves, is that this kind of like trying to always prove scientifically, like he really wanted to have an empirical science. He wanted his psychology to fit into what was being valued at that time. And so he's trying to take this ineffable, mystical relationship with soul and self and like translate it into a science. And as his work progresses, he does say, and it's littered throughout all the collective works, just like that can't be done. And science is actually what needs to be, the rational within us needs to be sacrificed in a certain way. And but I think like that cultural zeitgeist that he was trying to fit his work into has prevailed. And most people aren't familiar with Jung because it's not considered, dream work or looking at your life symbolically or shadow work. It's not this kind of, it doesn't come in this empirical validated framework that people want, that focuses on the agenda of getting fixed, right? So how can I have five sessions that follow a specific methodology and teach my ego to respond differently? It's like, that's pop psychology. That's what most people go to therapy for. And so this kind of mystical journey, which is much more arguably about encountering your deeper, darker self, just doesn't fit very well into that hygienic mind. And it's been skipped over. I think it's been skipped over in its complexity, in its spirituality, in its mysticism, and it's just, it's kind of lack of ordered, clear, easy, quick fixes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can completely, from a personal standpoint, resonate with that because of the experience I've gone through in the last few years, because this journey into the shadow and understanding these complexities within ourselves is far more vast than our analytical mind can even understand.
Totally.
So it's so important to explore these aspects of ourselves. I actually did a previous podcast. My last one was on spirituality. What is spirituality? And if we're not embracing a part of ourselves, of our existence, then we're not living wholly and fully. And that's also a teaching of his work too, is integrating the whole self, understanding our whole entire being, not just, components of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, and since we're kind of talking about, the modern condition, it's like one of the things Jung is very clear on, and is that so much pain comes from this disconnection with self and source, right? Is that we think that we think we're doing well in our kind of hygienic bleaching of what is unknowable and ineffable in us, and dark and frightening, and are we? It's interesting to talk to people who are a part of this conditioning, that you can say things like, well, you have to go, to understand a thing, you have to go into its darkness. And they're like, yeah, for sure. It's a knowing. We know this. And the people that do, for example, yourself, right, that undergo these darker moments that are really about the unraveling of who we think we are, what happens is that people end up finding themselves more deeply, and it feels good. And this is just something that's not put in, I think, the popular understanding, which is like, actually, you suffer more by avoiding this realm.
Yeah.
There's a price.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. I want to go into the anima and the animus for my own selfish reason, because I have you here, and I want to take advantage of your intel on this, because it is something that I can't wrap my head around exactly. I understand what the anima and animus is, and I'll have you explain it to everyone, because it's also a very fascinating, imagine them to be archetypes, as I think you referenced, right? They would be considered archetypes. So maybe you can explain, but also I would love if you can give an example. And I feel that's where I'm lacking in my understanding of the anima and the animus, is how it actually will manifest in ourselves and in our life, and where it actually comes from. So I'll let you take the stage with explaining it.
It does seem to me in the Jungian community right now that this is like the edgy conversation. Because so if we just take what Jung said about anima and animus, anima, Latin for soul, is the kind of feminine principle within. So related typically to, emotion, empathy, relatedness, the kind of somatic body, the qualities of the feminine, right? And animus is the masculine principle within. So you can get just as simple as that. And what Jung would say would be archetypally and this is where the edge gets. So I'll go to that in a second. He would say, if I was just kind of iterating Jung, that men, like that the conscious man, his ego identifies as male, right? And so his unconscious is going to identify as feminine. So the figures of his unconscious are going to present in a feminine form. And this was the case for Jung. He writes in his Red Book and throughout his work of, his kind of edgy encounters with the inner figure Salome, which he considered to be his anima, and really brought this idea to him. And the idea being that the man cannot access the feminine principle. And so his unconscious, which is the kind of compensation for that conscious attitude, is going to color itself in the feminine principle. And it'll be vice versa for a woman, right? That the unconscious comes in an animus form, which is, much more about, that kind of forthrightness in the world, the external, the protecting, the forward trajectory, like the masculine quality. And so this gets spicy in our current cultural questions around gender, and a lot of people have a lot of issue with that, like those specific categories. I would argue that actually one of the things that Jung talks about with the anima and animus is that we have both, right? And so there's actually a lot of inclusion in that, in saying that as a woman, as someone who identifies as a woman, I have the feminine anima and I have the animus, right? I have both. And as archetypal qualities, these just are, archetypes are a priori, meaning they stand outside of. So we can, as a culture, say, oh, you know, the masculine is this and the feminine is this, but it's like, actually those ideas predate what our culture is saying about them. They stand outside of that. And I think most people encounter anima and animus energy in dreams. So, you know, maybe you can ask yourself this, and your listeners can ask this, you know, whether you identify as male or female, whatever it is, do you have dream figures that present themselves in a specific gender, right? So for most women, you know, for me, I'll talk about myself, like the dreams in which I've had a like strong feminine figure are pretty far and far between. Like sometimes that happens, but I dream of different men and the unmarked man all the time, right? Which is a pretty common thing to hear, and men vice versa. You know, like most men come with dreams of anima figures, bringing them something that they need. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a quality of the feminine, but that somehow the kind of face of the unconscious for a man seems to be a woman, and vice versa. Does that answer any questions or just raise more questions?
It raises some more. It's okay.
Yeah, great.
Because for me, this is a very complex, for some reason,
it is. It's a very really complex idea.
I've had a really difficult time wrapping my head around this one. But I mean, I do understand as a man, you would have the animus, the women, and that's, you know, kind of as far as it goes in my mind. But I'm curious to know about the relationship with mother-father and how those relationships would play into the animus archetypes within ourselves.
I mean, that's a good question, and would probably, like, most honestly be very like case by case. But if I were to give a go at like a larger comment to that, my instinct would to say it's almost like, so mother and father are also archetypal, right? And also it's almost like I want to like layer them on top of each other, right? And say, and this is why I said case to case, like the way in which your mother complex or your personal relationship with the archetypal energy of mother in your life is going to color your relationship with the qualities that your mother manifested, right? And that's not necessarily going to be an anima problem, but it is going to color the way that you relate to the feminine principle through your mother, right? So if your mother was like really, really nurturing, and you know, kind of like Mother Hubbard in the kitchen mother, right? That's going to be really different than, you know, say a mother that was like very career focused and was never around, and like no judgment, right? They're all okay. But that career focused woman has more animus in her, right? Like Jung would call that animus possession, like the dominance of the feminine being infiltrated by not the cultural idea, but of what the masculine is, right? Because we could be like, well, women can do whatever they want and who cares, and like all of that. I'm not talking about the cultural judgment. I'm talking about the phenomenon of masculinity having more to do with what is external and manifesting in the outer world than the feminine does, right? The kind of like arrow being thrown is more masculine than the feminine. So a woman who is stepping into that role is taking on more qualities of the masculine, and in so taking on more qualities of the father, right? It gets a little like murky. And what is important when you work with archetypes is to pay attention to the subjective level of the archetype and the kind of a priori level of the archetype, right? So for mother and father, we're back at that subjective level of my father was like this, my mother was like this, which is going to color the individual experience of that archetype. Mothers are nurturing, mothers are overbearing and devouring. Like those are subjective experiences. The archetypal mother is both, right? Or as Jung kind of puts archetypes on a spectrum, right? Like we have both sides of these things. Same with the father, and same with animus and anima, right? So as both father and mother carry qualities of the feminine and the masculine within, they're going to have those anima, animus, almost like, that's why I'm saying I want to layer it. Like they're going to be in the same like dining room, but at core, their energies are different because the father and the mother are about the parental complex. And what that means in self is a little different than the anima problem. Does that make sense? I don't know. It's a complex. I'm sure your readers are spinning.
It is. Yeah. Thank you.
Probably one that's better done in an example, but.
So we're both wearing black, digging the shadow, liking the shadow aspects. I love to talk about the shadow, one of my favorite topics. And especially I feel with the happenings in the world right now, especially a lot of I would probably relate it to the collective shadow, you know, and if you could explain what the collective shadow is and how that is manifesting in our world today, and how we get through this by understanding the deeper and darker sides within ourselves to heal from these aspects, these unconscious aspects within ourselves.
So, you know, the shadow is Jung's word for the you know, we all you know, let me start with this idea. It's like, you know, like the Jungian psyche is oppositional. It is dualistic, right? We have ego, we have unconscious. We have this kind of divide within. And those opposites need to be in relationship and intention, right? And that's kind of a part of the kind of practical work. And the shadow is a really powerful example of that. Shadow is Jung's word to describe, you know, each of us go through life with an ideal version of ourselves. That ideal version gets shaped by, you know, the cultural conditioning we come through, the familial conditioning, what happens to us in life as individuals. And as that shape of identity, the right, quote unquote, identity gets shaped, the pieces that of our wholeness that do not fit into that have to get sloughed off, right? And the warehouse that Jung calls that, where those, you know, off-gassed pieces, so to speak, is the shadow, right? So essentially the shadow is what does not fit into our ideal, right? So, you know, if like you're the kindest, loving, sweetest person imaginable that gives everything you have to other people, your shadow is going to have that like narcissistic, selfish, self-consumed quality, because, you know, it's useful to see the unconscious like a seesaw, right? Or we have on one side ego, and on the other we have the unconscious, and the psyche is working towards that balance. And so if on one side you're hyper dominated by a certain idea, you know, I'm so generous and loving, the shadow is going to have the opposite side of that, right? Like, I've never hurt anybody in my life. Well, guess what? You've got a sadistic part of you. And so people do not like looking at the shadow because it is the encounter with the part of oneself that does not fit that ideal and goes against the grain of that agenda, but is ultimately about one's wholeness. And the shadow, you know, I would argue too, it's really important to know that we do not always just repress the bad in us. Right? If say you have, you know, you love to sing so much, that creativity is so great, and you're like one of those many kids in school that had a mean teacher and told you couldn't sing, and so you stopped singing. Like that creative voice in you, the song gets repressed, it gets put in the shadow. You know, a great myth to describe shadow is the Minotaur, which is a myth that comes from Greece. And the Minotaur was this like half man, half bull creature that was demonically born out of the, you know, the queen of Crete. And the king puts him in this labyrinth that like roams underneath the city. And, you know, there's all this mythology around kind of tributes being made to this like flesh-eating monster. But the monster's name was Asterion, which means starlight. And it's a wonderful kind of image of shadow, right? Is that like, we all repress these things that we think cannot be within our beings. And sometimes those things are, you know, parts that we have to get rid of to fit well into civilization, right? And a lot of times it's just parts of ourselves that have not been allowed enough light in our being to grow. And so most of us, I think of shadow work as exclusively negative because we are afraid of that which does not fit this ideal that I was speaking of. But remember, when you do shadow work, that sometimes what you're afraid of is not what you think it is, right? I can't be that. And it ends up being the best part of yourself. And so to know oneself, you know, and Jung would say, he says somewhere, you know, the encounter with shadow is like the first tight door you squeeze through to know yourself. It's like, that's when you meet who you really are, because it's not what you think you need to be, but actually a part of this wholeness. And it's kind of one of the first archetypal qualities that gets encountered in the inner work in the Jungian model. And so, right, so everybody can kind of get a sense of what that shadow is, and to now talk about the collective, right, is like think about what I mean. And we could go into a lot of collective shadows that we're working with right now as a culture. Are all of these things that we do not want to acknowledge have been culturally true, that gets repressed. You know, Jung writes and this would be a good example of the cultural shadow, writes a very controversial piece called Wotan that he wrote after World War I, and about the German psyche. And Wotan is the god of a German god of kind of forest. It's kind of a Pan figure, and violence, and kind of like the wild. And Jung writes this piece and he argues, like, you know, the German psyche has this like very powerful primal energy in it, and it's basically getting all this shame and pain from World War I, and that's going to go into the unconscious, and it's going to cause a compensation, right? Which then became World War II, right? And in the way that he talks about it. And so it's like, what you can see in this is that when we take these cultural pieces that were you know, like slicing out of our beings, they get repressed, and the shadow turns up in projected form, right? Which means we take that inner experience and we put it on another. And so you can see this maybe most personally individually, but it applies really easily to the collective. Is, you know, like, you know, when you dislike somebody, you like really hate this person. This isn't just like a dislike. It's like, you know, you're like chewing your arm off so you could throw it at them. Dislike. A good question is, okay, well, what part of myself is in that person that I dislike? Right? Why is my shadow showing up on that person? Because then I get to hate that person and I feel great because it's off of me. I've off-gassed the shadow, right? And so the collective shadow's problem is projection, right? We see that so much culturally right now. Like, it's your fault. We're in a changing world. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of uncertainty. Can we be with that uncertainty? Do we know how to sit with the fact that we're destroying our planet? That there's a part of all of us that is choosing every day to consume more and more despite what's happening? Like, this is shadow work. It's like, I don't want to see that part of myself. I care. It's like, well, really, you know, but you're living this way. You traveled here, you did this, right? And it's like, instead of being with that, of what does that mean? You can project it outward and say, well, it's those people. And if they didn't do this, it would be better. If they didn't do that, it would be this. And it can get really intense, right? It can become violent. It can become all of this energy of, I don't want to be with this. So the collective shadow problem is also a personal problem, right? And we have really, you know, we have these cultural shadows that have been built. Like, I'm thinking about, you know, like, I'm American. I think one of the major American collective shadows is the military, you know, of like, we do not want to go there with what that means to have the military that we do, and what has been done through our military, and what that means and what that asks of people. So it's just like this collective, you know, denial. Or I would say culturally, I think this is like, I think one of our really massive shadows right now is narcissism, which you see in the therapeutic, and I think more in the common lexicon. It's everywhere now. Like, everybody's narcissistic, you know, and it's like, of course we all are, but none of us want to look at that narcissistic shadow, that is choosing the luxuries of our life over the planet, that is choosing, you know, our individual experience over the collective experience, you know, that wants to keep this and doesn't want to get rid of this. All of this is a hyper self-focus. But instead of being like, wow, where am I narcissistic? It's now everybody around us is narcissistic. Like that asshole that cut you off in the coffee line is such a narcissist. I was like, really? I don't think that's what that word means, but we're like throwing that out because we are a hyper individualistic, self-focused society, but we do not want to acknowledge that. So it becomes this collective issue, and you can see it sprouting as all these problems with narcissism, when it's really like each and every one of us should look at where we have a hyper self-focus.
And thank you for mentioning narcissism. I didn't expect it to go into that.
Yeah,
well,
I'm just like, I'm shooting off the top of my head of like some of these collective shadows. And like I said, there's like, we could spend 2 weeks talking about the complexity of our collective shadows.
Oh, of course, of course. But because you mentioned narcissism, and this is based off of isn't this based off of a myth?
Yes, the myth of Narcissus.
The term.
Yeah.
What is narcissism? Because I agree with you. It is a term that is thrown out a lot. And I'd love for you to just quickly explain what the true meaning is and how it can be identified within oneself, and maybe the myth, just to tie it together.
Well, yeah, and you know, and it's a good, you know, and it kind of makes me, that question kind of makes me want to go back to that archetypal piece. And in one of the values of seeing the world archetypally is seeing that narcissism is actually an archetype. Right. And it has a very specific flavor in our culture and means something very specifically. But if we go back to that archetypal basis, which the myth will enlighten, right? Narcissus is like a very beautiful man. And he, and a wood nymph named Echo falls in love with him. And he, you know, is called into the forest by, you know, trying her love and her wanting her to love him. And he finds a pool of water and he stares in the water, and he is so beautiful that he falls in love with his reflection. And he stares and stares into the water, and he can't hear any other cry, can't tend anything, stops eating, stops drinking, and eventually dies. And out of his own kind of self-adoration. And so I think you can do a lot with that quality, right? And in some ways, what it's really saying is like the great love of self, the consuming love of self. And so, you know, we can make that really clinical and define narcissism in the more like clinical way of a psychopathology where arguably there is such a deep wound towards self that the compensation, the defense of that is this like hyper grandiose vision of self, you know, like live and well walking around in the modern world, like ultimate narcissism is Trump, right? He's such a narcissist. Like everything is about himself. Everything that he does is perfect. Everything is focused on himself. And you get this very pathological hyper individuality that is like, is exclusively focused on his own egoic or any one narcissistic egoic reality, right? And so there's that manifestation, right? That water that poured into the vessel. And also, you know, we could also say that a lot of people need a little bit of narcissism, right? Like how many people need to prioritize themselves a little bit to kind of fall in love with their own wonder. You know, Thomas More in his wonderful book, Hair of the Soul, has this beautiful piece on archetypal narcissism where he really talks about, you know, what is this true meaning for us? And actually, do we need to love ourselves a little bit more? You know, and like for those that give away easily, don't have boundaries, like, you know, are kind of in this place where the self-love and the like really need to sit down at that pool and be like, wow, I'm great. I'm worth loving. You know, it's like that quality of, and this is one of the main important things to keep in mind with archetypes is like we as a societal construct add our moral judgment, right? This form of narcissism is bad. This form of narcissism is good. Archetypally, that morality is culturally conditioned. It's not happening. It just is. right? So we have the experience of self-love that can be positive and nurturing and growing and connect us to something deeper, right? In the Narcissus, in the myth of Narcissus, when he dies, his body turns into the Narcissus flower, or the Narcissi, which is the flower that Persephone picks when she gets abducted by Hades. And in Greek culture and Greek worship, the underworld was Hades, there were no temples or specific rites to the underworld and to its god, out of fear, most likely. But the only thing that was done as an offering was picking Narcissus flowers. And they were seen to kind of open the gates to the underworld. So it's like we can go and take that myth further, right? And say, well, what is it about a little bit of self-focus, of love of self, that can take you deeper into what is within, right? And so that can be seen as a positive thing. That just depends on how the archetype's manifesting in yourself. If that kind of a priori focus of ability to focus and love self gets commandeered by a defense system that needs an inflation so that you're always better and better and better, so that you're never that small little one, you're going to get a pretty pathological manifestation of it, right? The liquid poured into the vessel, the note and the letter mailed to you that says self-love on it, is going to start looking different, right? Which is, so you can see the archetypal layer to that, and then see the sprouts of manifestation that might be really different. And we have to ask ourselves, what is healthy narcissism?
That's fascinating. It's almost, I would imagine, understanding the polarization of that, understanding the extremes, and then somehow arriving in that middle ground. It's the same as the light and the dark, all of these different archetypes and different extremes. When we're in too much of one, it's going to offset, or it's going to amplify. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's about that balance, right? And the polarity, absolutely, right? And somehow us holding tension between those polarities to create the balance that is somehow the right place for us to stand in.
Right. Before we conclude here this incredible conversation, I would love to talk about your book. So, Forged in Darkness. Now, I love this little statement that you have on your website. What if hardship could help you become who you were meant to be? So maybe explain your book a little bit, and I'll also add in here that Forged in Darkness returns the underworld moments in life to their rightful place, dreaded and scary, yet inevitable and enriching.
So my book was originally my doctoral dissertation, which underwent quite a makeover to become what it is now. And really the idea of it came from a personal experience where my brother suffered a massive brain injury, and during his recovery, one of the things that was told a lot to me was, he's a really good person and he'll be fine, and be strong, be a hero. And and it just got repeated over and over and over again. And I started wondering, well, of course he's a beautiful person. That doesn't mean he'll be given life. That's not a condition of living. And what does it mean to be a hero? And so these kind of questions, how are we understanding that, really, kind of just started germinating in me, and eventually manifested as this dissertation. And that became the book that essentially is this argument that, in our culture, we are told to manage the deep and the dark. And I use the word manage specifically, we are told to control it and clean it up in a really specific manner, which is get your shit together, be strong, be controlled, make it happen quickly, figure out what was valuable of it, and get yourself back on the march of success. And this is what we call heroic. We're the one that can rise above strongly and conquer. And that's actually only one hero myth. If only looking at the Greek world for brevity, the hero that embodies is Hercules, who's the great monster slayer, who has his sword and is strong and, battles everything and beats everything into submission. And so what the book really does is makes this kind of cultural argument of we really need to pay attention to what the underworld experience, meaning the dark, the painful, the unknown, the uncertain, the place in which where the lights go off and we no longer know our way around, that this place is actually incredibly fertile and valuable. And we have known this for eons. In a kind of twist of irony, the new phenomenon is not relating to the deep and dark. The very first burials and human remains and interactions that we have are about the afterlife. Like, we have been relating to the deep and dark forever, and not having an intimate relationship with that in our life is actually incredibly new. And yes, these places that we can find ourselves in are really, really hard and painful, and nobody wants to be in them. But nonetheless, like, tell me one person that has grown beyond who they thought they could be because they were comfortable, eating a donut on their couch. It's like, soul is made in the dark. This expansion of capacity is made in the dark. And so what becomes available to us, and this is kind of the question of the book, if we can free ourselves from only looking at the requirements to handle that domain through the Herculean lens, right? If you didn't have to be strong, if success wasn't you beating it into submission. And so the book is this celebration of the Herculean myth, because there are times when that capacity within us is really powerful, but also does this kind of mythic and psychological exploration of other heroes that also make underworld journeys, that what they do in the underworld is really, really different than Hercules, that could show us ways of imagining our own journey within that don't follow that Herculean plot. And I also do 3 gods and goddesses. Well, I do I do Hermes, Persephone, and Dionysus, as well as the heroes, to kind of elucidate how are there other ways of being, because the work, right, is about you finding your own relationship with what it means for you to be in these deep places, so that you can stretch yourself into who you are supposed to be, which tends to come from really hard things. And if we're keeping on shutting it out and keeping on telling ourselves these are wrong and bad, we miss the opportunity. We miss Joseph Campbell calls it the treasure so hard to attain.
Thank you, Joanna.
Yeah.
And as we conclude here, I always ask for a pearl of wisdom from the speakers. So if you have anything that you would like to share for the listeners and viewers, that'd be great.
Yeah, good question. Maybe I'll try to keep my pearl of wisdom in alignment with what we're talking about. And maybe it's as simple as, like, it's an inside job. It's not an external thing in our culture. And, like, the inside experience is a hard one and a difficult one, and one shared by us all. And, we live in a culture that has the illusion that you are who you are because there's an outside experience you can buy or get to. And that's not the case, right? As most wisdom traditions teach us. And yeah, it's an inside job. And that inside job is going to require looking at yourself through a dark lens.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Joanna. It was a
pleasure. You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. And I'll leave a link to your book, both on the podcast and the video as well. And is there anything else that you would like to leave us with? Any other information or contact?
Oh, I don't think so. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I'm sure you'll provide all the information to find my work or listen to, this podcast. And yeah.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, Joanna.
Yeah, you're welcome.